Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Laura with Connect My Brain. Thanks so much for tuning in. We have been moving through a list of different childhood labels that seem to be increasing all the time. And we've gone from what I would say is probably one of the most common, which is issues with attention, then looking at dyslexia, then looking at different types of stress and anxiety, even PTSD, and then looking at autism, Asperger. And today I'm going to go through some background information, what you can see with this particular, more of a diagnosis than a label. What it's called is PANDAS, PANS, but there is this component of OCD that is typically weaved in to the diagnosis. And sometimes children that are thought to be obsessive, parents later find out that they're really dealing with more of an autoimmune storm. So I'd like to jump in and get you some information about this. Well, we have a couple of pieces of history. I think it's very important because I think this part really impacts how we're handling as a healthcare culture, how we're handling these issues. And when you have so many kids, that are receiving diagnoses like this, I guess what I would really hope and I hope to convey is that it is so necessary for us to work together, all professionals. I can remember going after my CAS, which is a certified autism specialist, and that's one of the certifications that I hold. And one of the reasons I decided to work in this particular arena with the way that a governing board would say you have met the proper guidelines to help within this population. The reason I picked this particular group was at one of the conferences, they really talked about the need to embrace a wider net of professionals in looking to support these children so that we can get their development moving forward. I can remember that day, and I felt so positive because as a licensed chiropractor, the first thing anybody ever thinks when you say that you're a chiropractor is, oh, could you just take care of my aching back? And that is so limited, especially based on how we are educated. That's a 4-year program. It has even more hours than medical school. The only area that we don't spend a lot of time in, which I wish we did, was pharmacology because so many people are taking medications. And I think it's very important as a provider, a primary portal of entry provider, that you have to know what different medications are and you have to know what they're doing. And I think that's very important. And especially in this particular topic of pandas and pans, there's a need for collaboration. And I hope I really am able to demonstrate that case in this particular podcast. There's lots of different medical functional practitioners that absolutely embrace other professionals. But this particular topic is another area where controversy definitely came up between two different entities of medicine. One is the neurologist, and the other one is in psychiatry. So we'll talk about that as we move along. In fact, very, very much in the beginning of the presentation. So let's first define what PANDAS is. So the acronym is literally PANDAS, PANDAS, and it stands for Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Syndrome Associated with Strep Infection. Now, even 10 years ago, they thought it had something to do with strep, and today it's actually been validated that it absolutely has a correlation to strep. PANS, on the other hand, PANS, is pediatric acute onset neuropsychiatric syndrome. Both of these demonstrate some kind of, well, mainly PANDAS, is a sudden onset of odd behaviors like OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, motor tics following a strep infection. And this definition was laid out in 1998 by Susan Sweeto at the National Institute for Mental Health. This is where the controversy broke out between the neurologist and the psychiatric or psychology area, thinking that there's no way in the world that an infection is going to cause motor tics from the neurologist perspective, and then the different types of OCD type of behaviors possibly being linked to some kind of physical manifestation. So this is where I've been in this now for 28 years, and I've seen all kinds of things. And I just like, even what we experienced with COVID, that, we couldn't possibly have a conversation about something without somebody either getting censored, somebody getting mad, somebody getting fired. And at the end of the day, where did that get us? There are so many people whose lives have been completely disrupted. And you see that same type of thing for the families that are actually going through an autoimmune storm with their children. I mean, this is a real event. And, I already feel like in the arena that I work in child development, most of the time people, they don't find me. I'm not their first person that they go to. They typically find out something that there is going on for their child in school, and then they might try medications. They may not want to put their kids on medication, and they begin to search out. They may go to some tutoring, some speech therapy, and their child may get a little bit of improvement. I don't want to take anything away from anyone, but at most instances it's never enough, and they're not getting the resolution that they would hope, and what most people believe, that if something is going on and I am going to see a provider, that I should get resolution. I mean, that's just the innate thought process of every human being, and completely understandable. In this arena of PANS and PANDAS, these kids are very sick and they are plagued with something. Lots of it is PANDAS with a problem with strep and how it is now attacking the brain, or it has just completely disrupted their developmental sequence, or it's some other virus, but it is really impacting family and their ability to try to figure out what is going on with their child. and where they may go may tell them, I think it's just in your kid's head. Even the American Academy of Pediatrics, as well as the neurological group, medically orientated, they don't see this as a real diagnosis. And I think this is just the part that really frustrates me for people, and probably why I go as deep into this as I do, because I really want to try to be a place of hope and let me try and help you. So I have several kids in the practice that have been diagnosed with PANDAS or PANS. And there are absolutely, they've been working with functional MDs and making some progress. But lots of times, when only the chemistry part is addressed, or we only think about some type of behavioral therapy, we miss again this developmental sequence. And I talk about this in every single podcast because this is what I do. And I'm going to make that connection for you today about what's happening health wise to these children is principally an immune dysregulation. So if it is PANDAS and it is strep, many people today even think that strep is just a common childhood illness. If you think that, I'm going to ask you not to. You don't want to put yourself or your child in a position that something so difficult to go through could potentially happen if your child has continuously had strep infections and they've only been handled by an antibiotic. Now, that is the medical model. But what happens when we take an antibiotic? Let's just say, here's the infection way up here. So for the podcast audience, and this won't get to YouTube because I use the COVID word, but let's just say my hand is above my head, saying that my infection is way up here. An antibiotic is only going to drop it down so far. And if the immune response isn't corrected, it will happen again. Now, that's not the only issue. You also have to deal with that when we are given an antibiotic, it is typically a broad spectrum one. And so it's going to impact the gut microbiome, which means that I'm going to create an imbalance in my good and my bad bacteria. The other tricky thing about strep is that it mutates very quickly. It also has been determined that it demonstrates molecular mimicry because it is something that looks similar to different bacteria that is normal in the human body. And when we are getting these strep infections, they're typically going to go through the nasal pharynx, the nose, the throat. Well, the nose has a direct access to the brain. And so this is where the infection from unable to be resolved because of a dysregulated immune system can literally go and impact the brain. Even when you look at different studies about meningitis has the ability to cross the blood-brain barrier because of different reactions that are going on at the site of the barrier, which would impact the neuron itself, which is the thing that causes the headache. The neuron cannot fight it and it becomes disabled. And then here comes the immune system to try to attack it, and it becomes disabled. And therefore, the meningitis bacteria crosses the blood brain barrier and gets into the brain. And everybody is fully aware that meningitis can be very debilitating, and that is not something we want to happen. Well, if it can happen with meningitis is inflammation of the meninges, but it's a bacteria. But if that can happen, then why couldn't some other bacteria or virus get in there? This is what we have to understand. But the primary issue is the dysregulation of that immune response. The immune should be able to come in and check things. So in order to get a diagnosis of PANS or PANDAS, there's a certain criterion that must be met. There's one major that has to be in the criterion, and we've got two possibilities. One is abrupt and dramatic onset of obsessive-compulsive behaviors. This is actually OCB, and or this sudden restricted from food intake. They won't eat. Most functional providers prefer that children are not labeled with OCD. This OCD is under the mental disorder category, and it apparently is very difficult to remove. So we've got to have one of very obsessive behaviors and or food restriction or intake, and then two of the minors. And the minors are anxiety, which is considered a universal symptom in PANS and PANDAS. Anxiety can also be causing the oppositional compulsive behaviors. We've talked a lot about anxiety, so make sure you go back and listen to some of these other podcasts that are going to kind of weave other pieces of information in there. Some examples of this anxiety could be separation anxiety, social anxiety, phobias, and panic attacks. There can also be emotional lability. All kids have different types of emotion. So, you think about the terrible twos, you think about, teenagers being moody. So you have to look at this. Is it a normal amount? And is it, something that is expected? Does it match? I always talk about, does it match? So like I'm playing the matching game. I turn over a card, it's a duck. I turn over the other card, it's a cow. So it doesn't match. So you want to look at their emotional reactions and responses. Are they age expected? Do they match what's going on at the time? You can also, the other minors are depression, irritability, aggression, severe oppositional behavior, developmental regression. Suddenly regressing back to baby talk, or only wanting to play with baby toys. You'd really see something like this if there was a younger child in the house. Sucking their thumb, needing excessive rocking, holding, clinging. Of course, we are matching this also to the age of the child and, of course, meeting their needs. But again, we're talking about if it's really outside of what you had typically been seeing in your child. What about school? What you see in this is under the minors. All of a sudden, your child's work performance has dropped significantly. One of the areas, especially I would say more in our school age kids, is this would have an impact on like math and reading. Math, because there's a lot of short-term memory that is required and a lot of organizational skills when you're doing math. So when you're learning how to do computations, you have to be aware what you just did in a sequence of steps so that you can go back and do the next one. And then where you may have had excellent reading comprehension before, all of a sudden you can't remember anything that you read. There could be motor and sensory issues. This is where we put that possible motor tic or vocal tics. So a vocal tic is something like, not like you're saying a word, although you could, but it can also be making a clicking noise, a sniffing noise, or even clearing your throat. Some other sensory issues are dysgraphia, where you're having trouble writing or drawing. You could have mastered all of this before, and now your letters are drifting together, or you are starting up at one corner of the page, and by the time you finish writing, you're at the bottom corner of the other side of the page. You could have sensory integration, such as noises, loud, startling noises. Tactile, like you don't want clothes or tight fitting clothes on your body, or maybe no clothes at all. Shoes and socks. Some of these kids, like the seam that's typically on the forefoot, it's very irritating. And they may really want those shoelaces tied tightly because it gives them a feeling of where they are. There could be somatic symptoms, which means like bodily symptoms. One of the most common ones is sleep disruption. And then there could be urinary urgency, or still feeling like you're wet, even though you did properly dry yourself. So let's take that list, for example, and connect the dots for an autoimmune storm like PANS and PANDAS, driving a child's behavior back to primary rudimentary brain function. So let me break down those pieces. And I'm primarily talking about the minors, the anxiety, the emotional, the depression, irritability, etc. So I really want you to go back when you can and listen to the podcast on primitive reflexes. It is so important. And I'm going to really make an adult connection, hopefully, to help us understand how serious these reflexes are. Because it's not just in PANS and PANDAS, it's really in every single one of these things that we've talked about, that so many kids are being labeled today for. So you are growing inside of your mom. And I don't know if you've ever watched any kind of video footage on even cellular division and how the cells are coming together. And here we got the egg and sperm first, they come together. And then all of a sudden, there's just this bloom of cellular activity, and it's doubling and it's tripling and it's moving. Well, what makes the action go forward? What makes those cells then begin to fold inward and begin to create brain tissue, and then begin to create the heart and the gut and the intestines, the reproductive system, the elimination system, the arms and the legs, and then blooming a full person? Now, I believe it's a full person from the get-go, because you cannot have one step without the next, without the next. So you don't ever just get all of a sudden an arm budding without there having been cellular blooming going on. So imagine for a minute, where does all that come from? Now, I absolutely believe it comes from God, and it's his divine orchestration of life. But even if we bring it down to our human experience, you cannot deny that there is an energy, a life force, a divine intervention that is creating all of this. So what drives this? We can look at digestion. We can even look at how meningitis can cross over the blood-brain barrier. We need to appreciate all those other things that were going on, driving the movement from one stage to another and building the different systems inside of each and every one of us. So, as we've talked about before, we have the withdrawal reflexes that teaches us survivability, that teaches us how to be aware of our space, how to feel the most minute thing and make sure that we are safe. But we can also see that there's some that every time something new enters their space, they're actually distracted. They're actually hypervigilant. So we can continue to talk about how this has impact if it doesn't grow up, how it impacts different developmental sequences. Well, the same thing is true for what you're hearing even in PANS and PANDAS. Now we're gonna keep going deep dive, but I really want to impress upon you that these reflexes are there, that when the body burden becomes so great, you revert back into your brainstem. You are back into survival mode. You are back into the state where you have got to relearn, because right now you're not connected. If you as an adult had a stroke, or if you've ever known somebody that's had a stroke, what happens to them? Well, there's one side of the brain typically that's impacted, which typically has an impact on the other side of the body. Now, there's definitely things on the same side, but let's just keep it simple for today. So you may see that they're not using an arm and they're not using a leg, and it goes all the way down the middle, just like an ATNR, asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. So now one side of the body is functioning completely different than the other side of the body, but it's still being orchestrated by the brain. But it's also impacting the ability for that person to breathe, to eat, to swallow, for depending on the side of the body, but the left side of the body, for the heart regulation, for the descending colon, for the digestive system. And so all of those organs, all of those functions have to come back online. They have to come back online. They got to be retrained. So regardless of what you're going through, this is a mechanism that is innately in us to help us recover. I can remember when my mother had a stroke and I was working on her body, and I was working on her arm, and as my fingertips crossed over the palm of her hand, she reflexively closed her hand, just like a palmar reflex. Now, I got to tell you, she had a death grip because she's an adult, but it was right back there to that state. Now, here's the difference, though, between an adult and a child. An adult has had their maturation process. They've reached it. They have those motor sensories. They are able to write and have their memory. They've practiced it. They've graduated from school. They're not so close to the beginning of time. But children are so close to the beginning of time that when some type of illness or some type of roadblock to their development is halted, they don't have the point of reference. They didn't build their brains yet. They don't have a place to revert back to train again and put it back on. They're starting all over again. And this is why I think it is so important to understand how combining efforts with different professionals that are going to look at all these pieces, picking up the rock where nobody else has looked before, connecting the dots back to how did this child's brain get wired up? When we look at anxiety, that's part of the Moro reflex. The Moro reflex is going to activate arousal, CO2O2 reflex, and the sympathetic nervous system. So that state of anxiety is very much connected to a very primitive beginning of that Moro reflex. Emotional lability is a child reverting back to a younger state of mind. So wonder if it's this 8-year-old that's now been diagnosed with PANS or PANDAS, or it's a teenager and all of a sudden they're acting like terrible twos. They're reverting back. Depression, irritability, aggression, severe oppositional behavior is reverting back into their amygdala because the stress that is being created by this illness. The area that controls all of those behaviors is the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is just below the thalamus, and it's part of the limbic system. Developmental regression means reverting back. These are not just symptoms. These are the developmental sequences that each child was expected to master. So children that are reverting back to bedwetting, let's do a deep dive. Let's look at the blueprint and see if there is something that's going on that may pick up a rock and either show you that we need to add another piece or combine with what you're already doing to incorporate the body and the brain. PANS and PANDAS is a result of immune dysregulation. The secondary impact is on the brain. So a direct attack to the brain can result from what's called molecular mimicry. It is one of the leading mechanisms by which infection or chemical agents may induce autoimmunity. That is the self attacking the self. It is a case of mistaken identity made by the immune system. Your immune system takes aim at the wrong target. If the target organism is the brain, then your immune system will attack your brain. I want you to look up the Susan Cahalan story. I think that story was a real door opener for our healthcare system to really understand or get some passion to start looking at something that may be attacking the brain. It's currently on Netflix, but she is a reporter from New York City that just started having acute onset obsessive-compulsive behaviors. and led to, which I don't want to ruin the story for you, but literally was told that it is all in her brain. And in fact, it really was. So check out that movie. It's a true story. The indirect pathway is runaway inflammation. And this is very important because this is one of the heartbeats of what we do here at CMB. We look at different functional labs. And one of the biggest reasons why I look at MTHFR, one of the genetic snippets that we look at, is to make sure that a person's body knows how to methylate and get toxins out. When you have a mutation on this pathway, and then the severity of that mutation is based on which component of the gene may be mutated and how that's going to impact your ability to methylate. This is one of those areas where you're picking up the rock and you're going, okay, if you've got a mutation on the what we're going to call the C component, you have the potential for runaway inflammation. So if you're a person, a parent that thinks that having a strep infection is just childhood commonness, and your kid has a mutation, a C mutation on MTHFR, then your child could be at risk for this. So we got to look at these things. They give us information. You know, the most of the immune system is in your gut. You've got brain function for the immune system, but the big part of it is in your gut. So anything that is impacting your gut is going to impact your immune system, like leaky gut. So looking at the development of the gut, you know, what we're talking about in the womb, that's where the intestines are actually being grown and organized, but you still have quite a bit of maturation when you come out into the world. Your gut is going to mature around age 2, and then your immune system is around age 3. So we want to look at that blueprint. It draws the picture of any potential triggers surrounding the possibility of autoimmune risks. So does your child have strep in their history? And that can be strep A or B. Viruses, Epstein-Barr, influenza, gut viruses, Coxsackie virus, any of these things, they may not have been destroyed because the immune system isn't working right. There could be mycoplasma pneumonia, and any kind of tick-borne infection can also be very common in the population that is dealing with PANS and PANDAS. Okay, so like I said, I'm a chiropractor. So what am I doing in this? Well, let me tell you what the CMB difference is. We look at children. I have been working with children for 28 years. And this program looks at mechanical, it looks at chemical, and it looks at the brain. And the way that I got into this was really breaking down primitive reflexes, especially the Moro reflex, and especially because it drives the sympathetic nervous system. And if a child is in a chronic state of stress, their development can be completely derailed. So our job is to educate parents how to look at what might be under the rock. And the way that we do that is with our functional labs. But we also have families that have been working this journey. They have a child that has PANS or PANDAS, and they've been going through it for years. And they're tired. They have really gone through an enormous amount of resources. And so what we add to this picture is the brain and the body. You might be working with a functional doctor, but do you know what your child's brain really looks like? So, what we do is we do a brain map, and you can literally, on a brain map, you can see the result of chronic infection, chronic inflammation, and dysregulation. No, I'm not picking up strep in the brain, but could this be that I've got a child with low tone, can't have the proper timing with their upper body and their lower body, becoming incredibly emotionally dysregulated when you ask them to do too much? Yes, on the map, I'm going to see one of the test results because we get many reports, but one of them does it in a color scheme. And so there would be a lot of blue on that map, meaning that that brain is highly under aroused. Now, can you connect the dot where somebody with low tone would not have the power in their brain? Because the brain is giving feedback to the body, but the body gave feedback to turn on the brain. When that baby came into this world, it wasn't doing reading, writing, jumping jacks, or anything like that. It was lifting its head. It was rolling around. It was getting ready to crawl, hopefully. But if those movements, even back in the womb, when you were pregnant, the doctor asked you, hey, do you feel that baby moving? Your midwife said, hey, I can see the baby moving. So that movement piece is essential to wiring up the brain. So the brain map is matching what the physical assessment is demonstrating, because these are children. They are so close to the beginning. We're going to look from the bottom up, where on the adult, we're going to look from the top down. If your child is over aroused, man, that brain map might look like a red hot chili pepper. No, I am not picking up infection, inflammation. I am absolutely picking up dysregulation. And 100% of the time, it matches what you see in the physical assessment of the child. So we have the opportunity to bring other therapies into this equation that have not been previously included. It's not to take you away from who you're working with. We have to bridge relationship, all kinds of providers working together with one single mission: to care for the patient. Thank you for joining me today. If you got any questions, just feel free to reach out. You can call the office 678-501-5172. You can reach out. Maybe you have a question. Maybe you want to know, what could we do for your child? Send us a contact form from the website, connectmybrain.com. Go download the developmental milestones. I have it on my podcast tab, Dr. Hansen's Guide to Developmental Milestones. It's not 100% complete, but it really does cover. I really tried to put as much into it as I can, because right now you've been told by the CDC, changing developmental acquisition, that it's okay if your kid doesn't walk until 18 months. And I'm going to tell you that is not true. So we're here to support you. We're here to help you along that journey. And we really do understand what that journey's been like. Be blessed.